Look at a map of the world today. Look closely at the borders in the Middle East, in Europe, in North Africa. They look like simple lines drawn on paper with a pen. But they are not just lines. They are scars. They are the deep, bloody marks left behind by a giant. A giant that ruled the earth for 600 years, and then slowly, painfully, bled to death. Most people think they know how great empires die. They imagine huge battles. They picture foreign armies breaking down the city gates in the middle of the night. They think of loud explosions, brave last stands, and sudden defeat. But that is not how the greatest empire in the modern world actually collapsed. The real truth is much darker. The truth is hidden in secret palace whispers, in brothers murdering brothers, in quiet greed, in deep paranoia, and in an enemy that no army could ever fight: time. You are about to hear a story they do not teach in normal history classes. It is the story of the Ottoman Empire. But we will not just look at boring dates and dusty names. We are going to step inside the cold stone halls. We are going to smell the smoke of burning cities. We are going to feel the pure terror of a young prince waiting in the dark to be murdered by his own family. You will hear about women who ruled the world from the shadows of a golden cage. You will discover how mountains of foreign silver destroyed a perfect economy, and how a single secret deal pulled a giant into the deadliest war in human history. To understand how this massive giant died, you must first understand how it was born. And to do that, we have to go back to a time before the word Ottoman even existed. We have to go back to the darkness. The year was 1250. The world was burning. Out of the east, a terrible storm had come: the Mongols. They swept across Asia like a wave of pure fire. They destroyed ancient cities that had stood for thousands of years. They killed millions of people. Great, wealthy kingdoms fell to dust in a matter of days. People were terrified. Entire tribes grabbed whatever they could carry and ran toward the west, trying to escape the Mongol terror. They were running for their lives. One of these tribes was a small group of Turkish nomads. They had no kingdom. They had no great cities. They had no castles of stone. They only had their horses, their tents, and their swords. They stopped at the very edge of the known world, right on the border of the once mighty Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the last remaining piece of the old Roman Empire. For 1,000 years, it had been the light of the world. It had the biggest cities, the richest churches, and the tallest walls. But now, it was old. It was weak. Its leaders were completely corrupt, stealing money from their own starving people. Its citizens were tired and hungry. The borders were unguarded. And for a group of hungry warriors with nothing to lose, this was the perfect hunting ground. In this chaotic, lawless borderland, a man named Osman stepped forward. He was not a king. He was just a fighter. But he had something no one else had. He had a vision. Legend says that one night, Osman had a very strange dream. He dreamt that a massive tree grew straight out of his chest. Its branches covered the whole world. Its roots drank from the greatest rivers on earth. The leaves of the tree pointed like sharp swords toward the great cities of Europe. Osman woke up in the cold morning air and believed God had chosen him to build a new world order. And so, the Ottoman Empire was born. Not in a golden palace, but in a dusty, freezing camp of refugees and fighters in the middle of nowhere. At first, nobody paid attention to Osman. The powerful kings of Europe did not even know his name. They thought he was just another bandit stealing sheep and attacking small dirt villages. They completely ignored him. This was their first deadly mistake. What they did not know was that a completely new kind of machine was being built right under their noses.
Osman and his son Orhan did not just raid villages. They started keeping the land they took. And they did something very unusual for that time in history. They welcomed anyone who would fight for them. It did not matter if you were a Christian or a Muslim. It did not matter where you came from or what language you spoke. If you were loyal to Osman, you were part of the family. You got a share of the treasure. While the other kingdoms of the world fought over religion, the early Ottomans built a machine made of pure ambition. They moved quietly. They slowly choked the Byzantine cities. They cut off the farm roads. They starved the defenders. No food could go in. No people could come out. One by one, the ancient Greek cities surrendered just to survive. The giant was feeding. It was growing stronger. Then, the Ottomans did something that terrified all of Europe. They built small boats in the dark. They crossed the sea. They stepped foot into Europe itself. Suddenly, the bandit was in the living room. The kings of Europe finally panicked. They realized the bandit was now a monster. They called for massive holy wars. Kings, knights, and princes from all over Europe gathered giant armies to crush this new threat. They marched deep into the Balkans, wearing shining, heavy armor, totally sure they were going to win. They thought they were fighting wild barbarians. But they did not understand the enemy they were facing. Under leaders like Sultan Murad, the Ottoman army was faster. It was smarter. In the dark, muddy valleys of the Balkans, the heavy European knights were trapped. Their shiny armor made them slow. They sank in the mud. They were outsmarted, surrounded, and completely destroyed in a storm of arrows. The Ottoman sultans began calling themselves the Lords of Two Continents. They felt unstoppable. They felt like gods. But pride is a very dangerous thing. Just when the Ottomans thought they ruled the entire world, a ghost from their past returned to haunt them, and it almost wiped them off the map forever. Just as the empire reached its first great peak, everything shattered. It was the year 1402. The Ottoman Sultan was a man named Bayezid. People called him the Thunderbolt because he moved his armies so fast. He was fierce, strong, and incredibly arrogant. But far away to the east, another conqueror had risen. His name was Timur. He was a warlord who claimed to be the heir of the Mongols, the very terror the Ottomans had run from 100 years before. Timur sent a letter to Bayezid, demanding total surrender. Bayezid laughed. He insulted Timur. He called him a coward. This was a massive mistake. You do not insult a man who commands an army of 100,000 brutal veterans. Timur marched his massive army directly into Ottoman lands. The earth shook as the two titans crashed into each other. But the Ottoman army had a terrible secret. Some of Bayezid's own men had been secretly paid off by Timur. Right in the middle of the battle, they switched sides. They turned their weapons on their own friends. They betrayed their sultan. Bayezid was captured. The great sultan, the Thunderbolt, the master of Europe and Asia, was put in an iron cage like an animal. He was forced to travel in this cage, watching as his beautiful empire was torn to pieces by Timur's army. Bayezid died in that cage a few months later, completely broken, depressed, and humiliated. Suddenly, the Ottoman Empire was dead. It had lasted barely 100 years. The sons of Bayezid began to fight each other for the empty throne. It was a brutal, bloody civil war. Brother killed brother. The empire was ripped apart. How did they survive this? Why didn't Europe attack right then and finish them off forever? It was the perfect moment. The answer is shocking. Europe was too busy fighting itself. The kings of Europe missed their one perfect chance. They let the bleeding giant heal. After 10 years of endless bloodshed and terror, one brother finally stood victorious. The empire was glued back together. But the trauma of this civil war changed the Ottomans forever. They learned a very dark lesson. Power cannot be shared. A king can only have one ruler, and brothers are a threat. This dark idea would eventually poison the entire empire. Fast forward a few decades, the empire is strong again. The wounds have turned to scars, and a new sultan takes the throne. His name is Mehmed II. He is only 21 years old. Most people look at him and think he's just a weak boy. The older generals whisper behind his back. The enemies in Europe breathe a sigh of relief. But Mehmed has a dangerous obsession. A secret dream he has held since he was a child. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city with the strongest walls in the history of the world. No army had ever broken through those massive stone walls. For 1,000 years, it had survived every attack, every siege, every weapon. It was impossible to conquer. Many Ottomans had tried before and died trying. Mehmed decided he would do what was impossible. He hired a foreign engineer to build cannons so large they had to be pulled by 60 oxen. The cannonballs were the size of small cars. The ground shook when they fired. When the city locked the sea with a giant iron chain to stop his ships, Mehmed did something insane. He ordered his men to drag his warships across solid land. Thousands of men slid massive wooden boats on greased logs over a steep hill in the middle of the night, working in total silence, just to drop them into the water behind the chain. When the sun rose, the people of the city looked out their windows and saw enemy ships inside their harbor. They knew it was the end. On a bloody Tuesday in 1453, the impossible happened. The massive cannons finally cracked the ancient walls. The Ottomans poured into the city like a flood. The last Roman emperor died fighting in the dusty streets. The golden apple had fallen. The Ottoman Empire was no longer just a kingdom. It was a superpower. Mehmed walked into the great church of Hagia Sophia. He looked up at the giant golden dome. He touched the dust on the floor. He claimed the title of Caesar of Rome. The world was in absolute shock. The dark ages of Europe were officially over, and a new era of fear began. For the next 100 years, the Ottomans expanded everywhere. Under leaders like Selim the Grim, they marched south. They took Egypt. They took the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They took the massive wealth of the Middle East. Then, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, they marched north. They took Hungary. They marched all the way to the gates of Vienna. They built the greatest navy in the world. They controlled the trade routes that connected Europe to West Asia. Asia. If you wanted spices, if you wanted silk, if you wanted anything from the East, you had to pay the Ottomans. They became rich beyond imagination. Istanbul was a city of gold, marble, and perfect green gardens. The Sultan was seen as the shadow of God on earth. When he spoke, the world listened. His word was absolute law. He ate off golden plates, while kings in Europe slept in drafty stone castles. But shadows only exist when there is darkness. And behind the golden, jewel-covered doors of the palace, a terrible, Sickening darkness was growing. Remember the Civil War? Remember the fear of brothers fighting for the throne? Mehmed II had created a new law to stop civil wars from ever happening again. It was called the Law of Fratricide. It was a simple, brutal rule. When a new sultan took the throne, he was legally allowed, even encouraged, to murder all of his brothers, even the babies. Imagine being a young prince in the Ottoman palace. You live in a world of silk and gold, but you do not trust anyone. You look at them and see your future murderers. You know that the day your father dies, you will either become the most powerful man on earth, or you will be strangled to death by a silk cord in your bedroom. This pure, cold fear bred total paranoia. It bred monsters. Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest of all sultans, the man who brought the empire to its absolute peak, was eaten alive by this paranoia. He executed his own best friend. Then, manipulated by palace whispers and fake letters, he began to fear his own favorite son, Mustafa. Mustafa was loved by the army. He was loved by the people. He was the perfect prince. But Suleiman was terrified his son would take his throne. One day, Suleiman called Mustafa to his tent. When Mustafa walked in, his father was not there. Instead, death executioners stepped out of the shadows. They threw a silk cord around the prince's neck. Suleiman watched from behind a curtain as his own son fought for his life, kicking and gasping until he was dead. The empire wept, but nobody could stop it. The system was turning against itself. The absolute power was rotting their minds. To avoid killing innocent princes, later sultans decided to change the rule. Instead of murdering their brothers, they locked them away. They put them in a special, highly guarded part of the palace. It was a luxurious prison. It was called the cage. Princes would live their entire lives inside a few small rooms. They were never allowed to leave. They were never allowed to have children. They had no education in how to run a government. They had no friends. They just sat in the cage, waiting for decades, jumping at every footstep, wondering if today was the day the executioners would come to strangle them. When a sultan died without a son, the guards would go down to the cage. They would unlock the door and pull out a man who had been locked in a room for 40 years. A man who was half insane, terrified of his own shadow, crying and begging for his life. And they would put a giant diamond crown on his head and make him the ruler of the greatest empire on earth. How could an empire survive with a terrified madman on the throne? It could not. The real power had to go somewhere else. Since the sultans were going crazy, someone else had to run the empire. And that power fell into the hands of the mothers, the wives, and the secret advisors hidden deep inside the harem. Most people think the harem was just a place for women to relax. They are wrong. It was the deadliest, most ruthless political arena in the world. Women who had been brought as slaves from foreign lands fought a silent, invisible war. They fought to have their sons become the next sultan. They built massive spy networks. They bribed generals with bags of gold. They poisoned the tea of their rivals. They ruled the world from behind closed doors. One woman, named Kosum Sultan, became the most powerful person in the empire. She ruled from behind a curtain, telling her mad sons and young grandsons exactly what to do. She held the empire together through sheer terror and brilliant strategy. But in the Game of Thrones, no one is ever safe. After decades of ruling from the shadows, Kosum Sultan was betrayed by the servants of her own daughter-in-law. They broke into her room in the middle of the night and strangled her to death with a curtain cord. The palace was drowning in its own blood. While the palace was tearing itself apart with secret murders and poison, a much bigger disaster was happening outside the walls. The world was changing, and the Ottomans were so obsessed with their own palace games, they did not even notice until it was too late. Far away in the west, European sailors like Columbus and Vasco da Gama had discovered new ways to cross the oceans. They found the Americas. Suddenly, the old land trade routes that the Ottomans controlled were totally useless. Europe did not need to pay the Ottoman toll anymore. They bypassed the empire completely. The gold stopped flowing into Istanbul. The giant river of money dried up. At the exact same time, Spanish ships from the New World brought tons and tons of silver back to Europe. This cheap silver flooded across the borders into the Ottoman economy. It caused massive inflation. The Ottoman money lost its value almost overnight. A single silver coin bought a loaf of bread one week, and the next week you needed 10 coins, then 20. People could not buy food. The government could not pay the soldiers, and those soldiers were the most dangerous men in the empire. They were called the Janissaries. Centuries ago, the Ottomans had created a brilliant, terrifying system. They took young Christian boys from the villages in the Balkans, they converted them to Islam, trained them for years, and turned them into elite, fearless soldiers who were loyal only to the Sultan. For hundreds of years, the Janissaries were the terror of Europe. They never ran away, they never surrendered. But as the empire ran out of money, the Janissaries realized something very dangerous. They realized they had the real power. They were the ones holding the guns. They started demanding more gold. If the Sultan refused to pay them, they would walk out into the courtyard and flip their giant soup kettles upside down. The loud crash of metal on stone was their terrifying signal for rebellion. They would march out of their barracks, break down the doors of the palace, and physically drag the Sultan out. They murdered several sultans. They destroyed anyone who tried to stop them. The protectors of the empire had become its greatest parasite. They refused to learn new ways of fighting. They refused to use modern weapons because they thought it would threaten their special status. While European armies were drilling and inventing new tactics, the Janissaries just sat in the capital, extorting money from the shopkeepers and acting like a street mafia. The Ottoman engine was completely broken. The military was corrupt. The economy was collapsing. The leaders were locked in a cage or hiding from their own mothers. But the empire was so massive, so huge, that it took centuries to actually die. It was like a giant tree slowly rotting from the inside out. Year by year, the edges of the map started to crumble away. The Russians rose up in the north, hungry for warm water ports. They fought war after war against the Ottomans, slowly pushing them back. The Austrian Empire pushed from the west. The giant was bleeding. But the deadliest weapon of the 19th century was not a gun. It was not a cannon. It was an idea. The idea of nationalism. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been a giant mix of different people: Greeks, Serbs, Arabs, Turks, Armenians, and Jews. They all lived together under the rule of the Sultan. But as the French Revolution spread new ideas across the world, people began to think differently. The Greeks decided they wanted their own country. The Serbs wanted their own country. They did not want to be ruled by a distant empire anymore. Foreign powers saw this and smiled. Britain, France, and Russia sent secret shipments of weapons and money to the rebels inside the Ottoman borders. They wanted the giant to fall so they could steal the pieces. They whispered in the ears of the minorities, telling them to rise up, promising them freedom. Rebellions exploded across the Balkans. The Ottoman armies marched out to crush them, but it was too late. The blood soaked the mountains. It was a vicious cycle of massacres and revenge. Neighbors who had lived together for centuries suddenly turned on each other. The empire lost Greece. Then they lost Serbia. Then Romania. Millions of Muslim refugees who had lived in Europe for hundreds of years were suddenly slaughtered or forced to march back to Istanbul with nothing but the clothes on their backs. These refugees brought stories of unimaginable horror, disease, and starvation. They filled the streets of the capital, sleeping in mosque courtyards. The trauma of losing half the empire created a deep, burning anger in the heart of the Ottoman government. They felt like the whole world was against them. And they were right. The sultans tried desperately to save the sinking ship. They finally decided they had to destroy the corrupt janissaries. In one day of pure fire and blood, the Sultan turned his new artillery cannons on the janissary barracks right in the middle of the city and blew them to pieces. Thousands were killed. The old army was wiped out. The sultans tried to build a new, modern army. They built post offices. They laid telegraph lines across the desert. They bought modern rifles from Germany. They built factories. But to pay for all this expensive modern technology, they made a fatal mistake. They borrowed money from European banks. They borrowed millions. The debt grew like a cancer inside the empire. Soon, the Ottoman Empire could not even pay the interest on the loans. They were completely bankrupt. The European bankers came in, set up nice offices right in the middle of Istanbul, and took direct control of the Ottoman economy. They literally took the tax money from the citizens before the Sultan even saw it. The giant was now chained by invisible ropes of debt. The kings of Europe began calling the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. They made jokes about it at their dinner parties. They did not conquer it completely yet, but only because they were busy arguing with each other over who would get the biggest piece of the corpse when it finally died. In this terrible atmosphere of doom and fear, a new sultan took power in 1876. His name was Abdul Hamid II. He was a smart man, but he was consumed by paranoia. He looked out of his palace windows and saw enemies everywhere. The Russians were at the gates. The British were plotting in the south. His own people were angry and hungry. Abdul Hamid realized that Europe wanted to destroy him. He also realized his own young military officers were reading forbidden books from France. Books about democracy, about freedom, about revolution. He stopped trusting everyone. He built the largest secret police force the empire had ever seen. Spies were everywhere. They were listening in the coffee houses. They were watching the schools. Neighbors reported on neighbors. If you said the wrong thing, if you complained about the price of bread, you disappeared in the middle of the night. The word revolution was literally banned from the dictionary. You could not even point it in a book. The psychological pressure on the entire country was suffocating. People whispered in their own homes. Abdul Hamid tried to hold his breaking empire together with an iron grip. He promoted the idea of pure Islam to unite the people. He started building a massive, impossible railway heading through the boiling desert toward Mecca, trying to tie the empire together with steel rails. But fear cannot hold a breaking glass together forever. The cracks were too deep. Deep inside the military academies, hidden from the secret police, young officers were whispering in the dark. They called themselves the Young Turks. They believed the Sultan's fear was destroying the country. They wanted a modern nation. They wanted a constitution. They wanted pride. They wanted to stop being the sick man of Europe. In 1908, the pressure finally exploded. The Young Turks marched their armies toward the capital. The secret police dropped their badges and fled in terror. The Sultan, terrified, surrendered his absolute power. A year later, he was removed from the throne entirely. The people cheered in the streets. Christians, Muslims, and Jews hugged each other in the public squares. They threw flowers. They did not know the true nightmare was just about to begin. The Young Turks took control, but they inherited a collapsing house. Europe saw the chaos in Istanbul and immediately attacked. Italy invaded North Africa. Then, the small Balkan nations teamed up and launched a massive surprise war against the Ottomans. In just a few months, the Ottoman army was completely crushed. Almost all the remaining European territory was lost. The enemy armies marched to within a few miles of the capital. The sound of their cannons could be heard clearly in the Sultan's palace. The psychological shock to the nation was devastating. The empire had just lost the lands it had held for 500 years. The lands where the empire was born. The lands of Osman and Orhan were gone. The Young Turk leaders, terrified, angry, and humiliated, became completely radical. A trio of hardline men known as the Three Pashas seized total dictatorial power. They arrested anyone who disagreed with them. They believed the only way to survive was to militarize the state completely. They were looking for a savior. They were looking for a miracle to bring back their glory. In 1914, that miracle seemed to arrive, but it was actually a deadly trap. World War I broke out in Europe. The Ottoman Empire was incredibly weak, totally broke, and exhausted from years of fighting. Any sane leader would have stayed out of it. But the Three Pashas made a secret deal in the dark. They signed a hidden treaty with the powerful German Empire. They thought Germany would win quickly and they could take back their lost lands. They thought this was their chance to be giants again. A few months later, German warships flying the Ottoman flag sneaked across the sea and bombed Russian ports. The trap snapped shut. The Ottoman Empire was dragged into the greatest, bloodiest slaughter in human history. There was no going back. The war was a total disaster from the very first day. The Ottoman armies were sent into the freezing mountains of the Caucasus to fight the massive Russian army. The generals made terrible mistakes. 90,000 Ottoman soldiers marched into the deep snow without proper winter coats or boots. Tens of thousands froze to death in the mountains before they even fired a single bullet. The army was wiped out by the cold. Panic spread in the capital. The empire was fighting for its very survival on multiple fronts. The British were attacking from the sea. The Russians were pushing through the mountains. Paranoia reached a boiling point. The leaders in Istanbul began to look at their own people as enemies. This paranoia led to the darkest, most terrible chapter in Ottoman history. The government ordered the mass deportation of the entire Armenian population, accusing them of secretly siding with the Russians. It did not matter if they were loyal. It did not matter if they were innocent. The fear had taken over completely. Hundreds of thousands of Armenian men, women, and children were dragged from their homes. They were forced to march into the blazing heat of the Syrian desert. In the dust and heat, starvation, disease, and brutal massacres claimed countless lives. It was an unimaginable tragedy. The death toll was catastrophic, leaving a permanent, bleeding scar on history. The the world watched in pure horror as the fabric of human morality tore completely apart. The empire was eating its own people. While this nightmare unfolded, the British were attacking from the south, and the British had a secret weapon. They knew the Ottoman Empire was made of many different nations. They sent spies, like the famous Lawrence of Arabia, deep into the desert. They carried bags of gold and beautiful promises. They promised the Arab leaders their own independent, glorious kingdoms if they would only rebel against the Turks. The Arabs, wanting freedom from the crumbling empire, took the deal. The Arab revolt broke the back of the Ottoman forces in the Middle East. The holy cities were lost. Jerusalem fell to the British. Damascus fell. The great railway tracks the Sultan had built were blown to pieces in the night. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The soldiers in the trenches had no shoes. They had no bread. They were fighting ghosts in the desert. By 1918, the German Empire collapsed, and the Ottomans were left completely alone. The three pashas, the men who had dragged the empire into this hell, knew they were dead men. They packed their bags in the middle of the night. They boarded a German submarine and fled into the dark waters, leaving their ruined, starving nation behind. They ran away. The giant was finally dead. The victorious Allies sailed their massive gray warships right into the beautiful waters of Istanbul. The huge guns of the British, French, and Italian fleets pointed directly at the windows of the Sultan's palace. For the first time in almost 500 years, the capital of the world was occupied by a foreign army. The Allies pulled out a map of the Middle East and laid it on a table. They drew lines with a pencil. They gave Syria to France. They gave Iraq and Palestine to Britain. They gave pieces of the Turkish mainland to Italy and Greece. They planned to wipe the very name of the Ottomans off the map completely. They wanted to make sure the giant never woke up again. They were dividing the corpse. The last sultan was a prisoner in his own home. Terrified, he signed the death warrant of his own empire. He agreed to the total surrender. He thought that if he just obeyed the Europeans, they might let him keep his palace and his life. But the story does not end with a signature on a piece of paper. The final twist was yet to come. Deep in the heart of Anatolia, far away from the enemy guns on the coast, an Ottoman general was watching this betrayal. His name was Mustafa Kemal. He was a brilliant commander who had never lost a single battle during the World War. He looked at the surrender and refused to accept the death of his nation. He stripped off his Ottoman uniform. He traveled to the poor, starving villages of the mainland. He called upon the broken people, the farmers, the widows, the orphans. He told them they had one last fight left, not for an empire. The empire was dead. This fight was for survival. If they lost, they would be erased from history completely. There would be no tomorrow. Against all odds, fighting against the invading Greeks, the French, the British, and even the Sultan's own private army, Mustafa Kemal led a miraculous, bloody war of independence. He rallied the people. He pushed the foreign armies back. He drove them into the sea. He saved the homeland from total erasure. He did the impossible. But he knew the Ottoman Empire was a rotting corpse. It could not be saved. It had to be buried forever, so something new could live. In 1922, the new Parliament of the People voted to abolish the Sultanate forever. The 600-year rule of the House of Osman, the descendants of the man with the dream of the giant tree, was canceled in a single afternoon. 6 centuries of power, erased by a vote. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, slipped out the back door of his palace in the middle of the night. He walked onto a British warship carrying only a small suitcase. He looked back one last time at the great city his ancestor had conquered, and then he sailed away into exile, never to return. The Caliphate, the spiritual leadership of the Islamic world that the Ottomans had held for centuries, was abolished shortly after. The entire world order shifted. The schools were changed. The alphabet was changed. The clothes were changed. The Republic of Turkey was born from the white-hot ashes of the giant. The transition was brutal. The old world was forcefully erased to make way for the new. The great echoing palaces of Istanbul became silent museums. The golden cages where mad princes used to cry in the dark were suddenly empty. The giant cannons that once terrified the kings of Europe rusted quietly in the tall grass.
Why did it fall? Was it the lack of money? Was it the corrupt soldiers flipping their kettles? Was it the betrayal of the West? Was it the poison of nationalism? Or was it simply the crushing weight of time?
Perhaps it is the dark nature of all human empires. They start as a desperate, hungry dream in the wilderness. They grow through ambition, struggle, and blood. They reach the peak of absolute power and build massive walls of gold and marble to protect themselves. And then, slowly, they forget what made them strong.
They lock themselves in cages of paranoia. They stop looking outward and start destroying themselves from within. They become afraid of their own shadows. They trade loyalty for fear. And when the foundations rot, it only takes a single storm to bring the entire house crashing down. The complete fall of the Ottoman Empire is not just a history lesson you read in a dusty book. It is a mirror. It shows us the terrifying truth about human power. No matter how strong the walls are built, no matter how much gold is locked in the treasury, nothing lasts forever. The shadows always catch up. The next time you look at a map of the world, do not just see countries and colors. See the fault lines of a massive earthquake. See the invisible borders drawn by greed, by war, and by the desperate need to survive. The Ottoman Empire is gone, buried deep under the dust of modern cities. But its ghosts are still whispering in the wind. And if you listen closely, in the silence of history, they are warning us.